Welcome back. Tonight's story begins with a performance that no one could hear. A full concert hall, hundreds of witnesses, a pianist at the keys, his fingers moving perfectly. And yet, not a single note was played. Minutes later, he was found dead. But here is the question that will trouble you long after this story ends. How can a man perform after he is already dead? I am Dr. Watson, and what you are about to hear is one of the most unsettling cases ever investigated by Sherlock Holmes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from, and what is your favourite Sherlock Holmes story? And if you prefer listening, you can find us on Spotify as well. Now, let us return to that silent performance. Chapter 1. The Silent Performance. The rain had not relented since morning. It came in sheets against the windows of 221B Baker Street, rattling the old frames with a persistence that might have been admirable in any other context. The fire in the grate had burned low, and the room smelled of cold tobacco, and the particular staleness that accumulates when a restless mind has been confined too long within familiar walls. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair with his legs drawn up beneath him, his dressing gown pulled tight across his narrow shoulders, and his gaze fixed upon nothing at all. He had not spoken in over an hour. The Persian slipper on the mantelpiece had been emptied of its tobacco twice since luncheon, and the jackknife that pinned his unanswered correspondence to the wood above the fireplace had been removed, examined, and replaced no fewer than 4 times. And these were the signs, as legible to me as any printed text, of a man in the grip of that dangerous vacancy which descended upon him whenever London's criminal class failed to provide adequate stimulation. I had attempted, with diminishing conviction, to engage him in conversation. The weather was discussed and dismissed. A monograph on tropical diseases recently published by a colleague at Bart's received a single syllable of acknowledgement. I had even ventured a remark about a concert review in that morning's edition of The Times, in which the critic had praised a performance at the Wigmore Hall as a transcendent. Transcendent, Holmes repeated, without moving his eyes from the ceiling. The word has been applied to 14 separate performances in that publication this season alone. I counted. When everything transcends, Watson, nothing does. The London musical establishment is a closed circle of mutual flattery, sustained by the inability of its audience to distinguish technical competence from genuine art. You are in a foul temper, I said. I am in no temper at all. That is precisely the difficulty. I returned to my newspaper and resolved to leave him to his brooding. The clock on the mantelpiece marked 7:30. Mrs. Hudson had cleared the supper things an hour ago, and I was considering whether to retire early with a volume of Clark Russell, when the sharp, distinctive sound of the front door knocker cut through the drumming of the rain. Holmes's eyes moved for the first time, not toward the door, toward me. There was in that glance a flicker of something I'd seen 100 times before, the first spark of a fire that had been waiting for fuel. "A telegram," he said. "The boys knock. 2 strikes, a pause, then a third. Billy has been running. The envelope will be damp on the left side, where he holds it against his coat." The boy appeared moments later, breathless and dripping, and handed the envelope to Holmes, who tore it open with a fingernail. I watched his face as he read. The transformation was not dramatic. Holmes was never theatrical in his private responses. But the stillness that had oppressed his features for days dissolved, replaced by an alertness that sharpened every line of his lean countenance. "Watson," he said, "how quickly can you dress?" 10 minutes. What has happened?" He handed me the telegram. It was from Inspector Lestrade, and it read, "Pianist found dead at piano during performance. Aeolian Hall. Circumstances extraordinary. Your presence requested." "Extraordinary," Holmes murmured, reaching for his coat. Lestrade does not use that word unless his own faculties have been thoroughly overwhelmed, which, admittedly, is not a high threshold. But the setting intrigues me. Aeolian Hall, a public death during a public performance. That suggests either remarkable carelessness or remarkable confidence. Dress warmly. I suspect we shall be some time. The cab ride through the rain-washed streets took 20 minutes, though it felt longer. Holmes sat in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half closed. I knew better than to interrupt him when he wore that expression. He was not thinking about the case. He knew nothing yet. He was preparing the instrument of his mind, clearing it of the rust and cobwebs of inactivity, readying it to receive whatever impressions awaited us. The streets of Mayfair glistened under the gas lamps, and the pavements were nearly empty. A few cabs passed us, heading in the opposite direction, and once a police wagon overtook us at speed, its lanterns swaying. Holmes noted it, but said nothing. Aeolian Hall stood on New Bond Street, its facade elegant and restrained in the Georgian style. But tonight it was surrounded by a scene that belonged more to the steps of a police court than to a concert venue. 2 constables flanked the main entrance. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered despite the weather, huddled beneath umbrellas and speaking in low, excited voices. Through the glass doors, I could see the lobby blazing with electric light and filled with people. The detained audience, I presumed, kept inside at the instruction of the police. Lestrade met us at the door. He was a lean, ferret-faced man with sharp eyes and a perpetual air of professional scepticism. But tonight his expression carried something I had seldom seen in him. Genuine bewilderment. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Holmes. And you, Doctor. I'll be frank. I've seen a great many peculiar things in my years at the Yard, but this is something I cannot account for." "Then account for what you can," Holmes said, already scanning the lobby with rapid, cataloguing glances. "The facts, Lestrade. Only the facts." Lestrade led us through a side corridor, away from the murmuring crowd. The deceased is Elias Varn, 61 years of age. One of the most celebrated concert pianists in London, perhaps in Europe. He was engaged for a solo recital this evening. Programme was Chopin, Clementi, and one of his own compositions. The hall was full, 320 seats, near enough all taken. "The time?" Holmes asked. The curtain rose at 10 minutes to 8. The audience saw Varn seated at the grand piano centre stage. His fingers were moving across the keys. Lestrade paused, and I saw his jaw tighten. "But there was no sound, Mr. Holmes. Not a note. The keys moved. The man sat upright. And the hall was perfectly silent." Holmes stopped walking. "No sound at all?" "None. At first, the audience assumed it was deliberate. Some sort of modern artistic statement. Several of them told me they thought it was meant to be provocative, but after 5 minutes, the unease became general. A stagehand, a man named Briggs, approached from the wings and touched Varn's shoulder. Lestrade swallowed. The body slumped forward onto the keys. The man was dead. Had been dead, by all appearances, for some time before the curtain ever rose. We had reached the door that led from the corridor to the wings of the stage. Lestrade placed his hand on the handle, but did not open it. "Has the body been moved?" Holmes asked. "No, sir. I gave orders that nothing be touched." "The piano?" "As it was." "The stage lighting?" "Exactly as it was during the performance. One of the stage hands maintained the settings on my instruction." Holmes regarded Lestrade with a fractional nod that from him constituted high praise. "You have done well. Now, has anyone entered or exited the stage since the body was discovered?" "The stagehand who found him. The police surgeon, Dr. Enfield, who examined the body briefly and pronounced death. 2 of my constables. No one else." "Dr. Enfield's preliminary assessment?" "Heart failure. Varn was 61, known to suffer from occasional chest complaints. Enfield says it is consistent with a sudden cardiac event." "And yet you sent for me," Holmes said quietly. Lestrade met his gaze. "Because dead men don't play the piano, Mr. Holmes, however their hearts gave out." Holmes smiled, the thinnest and most private of smiles, and pushed open the door. The stage of Aeolian Hall was not large, as concert stages go, but in the circumstances it possessed a quality of dreadful theatre that no set designer could have contrived. A single stage light burned above, casting a warm amber cone over the centre of the platform where the grand piano stood, a magnificent Bechstein, its black lacquer reflecting the light like still water. And seated at the instrument, upright, immaculate in evening dress, his hands resting upon the keys, was the body of Elias Varn. I have seen death in many forms. I've seen it on the battlefields of Afghanistan, in the fever wards of Peshawar, in the cold back rooms of London lodging houses, but I had never seen it arranged with such deliberate composure. Varn sat as though he were merely waiting for the audience to settle before beginning his performance. His back was straight. His head was inclined slightly forward in the attitude of concentration. His coat was buttoned, his collar crisp, his white hair neatly combed. And his hands lay across the keys with the fingers extended, touching the ivory surface with what appeared, at first glance, to be the easy familiarity of a master at his instrument. Holmes approached slowly. He did not go directly to the body. Instead, he circled the piano at a distance of several feet, his eyes moving across every surface, the floor, the wings, the curtain rigging, the lighting apparatus overhead. He crouched once to examine something on the boards near the left leg of the piano bench, then straightened and continued his circuit. I remained at the edge of the stage, near the wings, watching him. Lestrade stood beside me, his arms folded, his face tight with the expression of a man who has relinquished control and is not yet certain whether he will regret it. Holmes completed his circuit and came to stand directly before the body. He leaned forward, bringing his face to within inches of Varn's hands. He remained in that position for a long time, perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps a full minute, utterly motionless, his breath shallow, his grey eyes moving across the dead man's fingers with the intensity of a jeweller examining a suspect stone. Then he straightened. "Watson," he said, and his voice was quiet, precise, stripped of all the earlier restlessness and filled instead with that calm certainty I'd come to recognize as the beginning of the chase. "Come here, observe the hands." I crossed to him and looked down at the pianist's fingers, where they rested upon the keys. "What do you see?" Holmes asked. "A dead man's hands upon a piano," I replied. "Yes, but observe how they rest. The fingers are flat, Watson, laid across the keys like objects placed upon a shelf. There is no curvature, no engagement of the tendons, no distribution of weight through the forearm." He took my wrist gently and positioned my own hand above the keys beside Varn's. "Press a key, lightly." I did so. My fingers curved naturally to meet the resistance of the key, and I felt the subtle tension travel up through my wrist and forearm. "Now, look at his hand again," Holmes said. I understood. Where my hand had responded to the instrument, had entered into a kind of mechanical conversation with it, Varn's fingers merely lay there. They touched the keys the way a book touches a table, passively, without reciprocity. "A pianist's hands are never at rest," Holmes said, "even in death. The musculature retains the memory of its training, the curvature, the habitual positioning. These hands have not fallen naturally. They have been arranged, Watson, placed upon the keys by someone who understood the general picture of a pianist at work, but not the particular truth of it." He turned to Lestrade, who had come forward to listen. "Inspector, you were right to send for me. This is not a man who died at his instrument. This is a man who was placed here, after death, by someone who wished 300 people to watch a dead man perform." His gaze swept once more across the silent stage, the gleaming piano, the motionless figure beneath the amber light. "Clear the auditorium, hold every person who had backstage access this evening, and send no one onto this stage until I have finished." Lestrade nodded and withdrew. I remained beside Holmes, who stood looking down at the body with an expression I knew well, that mixture of fascination and cold fury that seized him whenever he encountered a crime of particular audacity. "What kind of man does this?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. The rain drummed against the high windows of the hall, and the silence of the stage seemed to deepen around us, as though the room itself were holding its breath. "A man who understands mechanisms," Holmes said at last. "A man who knows how things work from the inside, how to make them move, and how to make them stop. That is the man we are looking for, Watson, and I believe he was in this building tonight." Chapter 2. The Dead Man's Audience. Holmes remained on the stage. He had not moved from his position beside the piano, and I knew from long experience that when he stood in that particular attitude, weight forward on the balls of his feet, hands clasped behind his back, chin slightly raised, he was absorbing the scene with every faculty he possessed. He would not welcome interruption. He would not welcome company. "Watson," he said without turning, "go with Lestrade. The audience is being held in the lobby. I need their eyes, what they saw, what they heard, what they felt. You are better suited to that work than I. People speak freely to you. They do not speak freely to me." It was, in its way, a compliment, though delivered with the same offhand efficiency with which he might have asked me to pass the coal scuttle. I left him alone beneath the stage light and made my way through the wings to the corridor that connected the backstage area to the front of house. The lobby of Aeolian Hall was a handsome space. Marble floors, cream walls, brass fittings polished to a military shine. But tonight it had the atmosphere of a railway waiting room after a cancellation. 320 people, give or take, stood or sat in clusters, speaking in the low, urgent tones of those who have witnessed something they do not yet understand. Constables were positioned at each exit, and Lestrade's sergeant, a capable man named Bradstreet, was moving through the crowd with a notebook, taking names and addresses. Lestrade appeared at my elbow. "The inspector wants me to release them in groups once we have their details," Bradstreet said. "But some of the more important ones are making noises about their solicitors." "Hold them all until I say otherwise," Lestrade replied. "Mr. Holmes's orders." He turned to me. "Doctor, see what you can gather. I'll manage the logistics." I moved into the crowd. There is a particular quality to the conversation of people who have been confined against their will in the aftermath of a shocking event, a mixture of indignation, excitement, and a strange competitive eagerness to have been the one who noticed something first. I have observed it at the scenes of railway accidents and house fires, and I observed it now. The first person who approached me voluntarily was a stout, florid man with a waxed moustache and a press card tucked into the band of his hat. He introduced himself as Arthur Cleeve, music critic for the Daily Telegraph. And he was bursting with the need to tell someone what he had seen. "I have covered every significant recital in London for 11 years, Cleeve said, gripping my arm with the fervour of a man who believes his testimony to be of historic importance. "I have seen Paderewski. I have seen Busoni. I have heard performances that moved me to tears and performances that moved me to fury. But I have never, Doctor, experienced anything like what I witnessed tonight." "Tell me precisely what you saw," I said. The curtain rose at 10 minutes to 8. Varn was seated at the Bechstein, exactly as you might expect. Upright, composed, his hands upon the keys. The hall was silent. 300 people, every one of them holding their breath. And then his fingers began to move. Describe the movement. It was, how shall I put it, immaculate. The fingers depressed the keys in sequence, following what I recognized as the opening bars of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The tempo was exact. The phrasing, insofar as one can judge phrasing without sound, appeared correct. But there was no sound, Doctor. Not a whisper. Not a single note. "What did you make of it?" Cleeve hesitated. At first, I assumed it was deliberate. Varn had always been, forgive me for speaking so of the dead, somewhat self-regarding in his artistic choices. I thought it was a statement, a provocation. The pianist who plays silence. I even began composing my review in my head. He had the decency to look slightly ashamed. It was only after several minutes, when the stagehand came forward, that I understood. I thanked Cleeve and moved on. A society matron in emerald silk, who gave her name as Lady Ashworth, confirmed the general account but added a detail of her own. There was something wrong with the rhythm of it, she said, and though she could not articulate what she meant in technical terms, the observation struck me. It was too even, she continued, like a metronome, like a music box. My daughter takes piano lessons and she plays like that, perfectly timed and perfectly lifeless. But Varn was a master. He never played like that. I noted this carefully. The observation aligned with something I had felt myself during Cleve's account, a sense that the movement described was too precise, too regular, lacking the subtle variations of tempo and emphasis that distinguish human performance from mechanical reproduction. I sought out the front-of-house usher, a young man named Coates, who had been stationed at the main entrance throughout the evening. Coates was pale and visibly shaken, but he answered my questions with commendable clarity. "I was at the doors from 6:30, sir. I checked every ticket personally." "I need the arrival times of specific individuals," I said. "Do you recall a man named Leon Moreau?" "The French pianist?" "Yes, sir. He arrived at 7:30 precisely. I recognized him from his photograph in the program. He went straight to his seat, 3rd row, centre." "A man named Edmund Klein?" Coates thought for a moment. "I know Mr. Klein by sight. He's Mr. Varn's piano man. He came in through the front entrance at, I should say, 7:45, or very close to it. Perhaps 7:42 or 7:43. I noticed because he seemed slightly out of breath, and he paused in the lobby to adjust his cuffs before going through to the auditorium." "Out of breath?" "Yes, sir, as though he had been walking quickly, or running." "And Mrs. Varn, the pianist's wife?" "She arrived late, sir. I remember because the curtain had already risen. It must have been close to 10 minutes to 8. No, later. Perhaps 12 or 13 minutes to 8. She went up the side staircase to the private box above the stage. I recorded these times in my notebook. Moreau at 7:30, Klein at approximately 7:42, Dorothea Varn at approximately 7:48. Each would require verification, but Coates struck me as a reliable witness, precise in his recollections and unprompted in his details. I continued through the lobby. Near the cloakroom, I found Leon Moreau standing apart from the crowd with his arms folded and his back against the wall. He was a compact man of perhaps 45, dark-haired with sharp features and an expression of controlled hostility that seemed less a response to the evening's events than a permanent condition of his temperament. "Dr. Watson," he said, before I'd introduced myself. "I know who you are, and I know why you are here. Your associate is on the stage, no doubt, examining the body with his magnifying lens and making pronouncements that will appear in the popular press tomorrow." "You knew Mr. Varn," I said, ignoring the provocation. "I knew him. Every pianist in London knew him. He was, what is the English expression, the tall poppy, the one everyone watches. The one who receives the invitations and the fees and the reviews that use words like transcendent." The bitterness in his voice was undisguised. "I was to have had this season at Aeolian Hall. Did you know that? The engagement was mine." And then Varn expressed interest, and Hallberg, the organizer, fell over himself to accommodate the great man. "You must have resented that deeply." Moreau's eyes narrowed. "I resented it, yes. But resentment is not a crime, Doctor. If it were, half the musicians in London would be in Pentonville." He paused, then added, with a coldness that I found deeply unpleasant, "The man finally performed without feeling. How fitting." I left Moreau with the distinct impression that he wished me to suspect him, as though the role of prime suspect were another kind of spotlight he was determined to occupy. It was a curious reaction, and I noted it without yet understanding it. In the far corner of the lobby, seated alone on a velvet bench, I found a young woman weeping quietly into a handkerchief. She was perhaps 25, fair-haired, dressed simply but with evident care. A programme lay crumpled in her lap. One of the constables told me her name was Clara Weiss, and that she had identified herself as a pupil of the deceased. I sat beside her and spoke gently. She could barely form sentences through her distress. but between sobs she told me that Varn had been her teacher for 3 years, that he had transformed her understanding of music, and that she could not comprehend how this had happened. When I asked whether she had been backstage that evening, she nodded. I went to wish him well before the performance. I did, before every concert. He was in the green room. We spoke briefly. Her voice faltered. He seemed distracted, preoccupied. I left before 7:30. I did not press her further. Her grief appeared entirely genuine, and I saw no purpose in adding to her suffering at that moment. But I noted the fact of her backstage presence and resolved to return to it. The last figure of immediate interest was the concert organizer, Mr. Hallberg, a tall, thin man with receding hair, and the harried aspect of someone for whom the evening's tragedy was primarily a financial catastrophe. I found him pacing near the box office, muttering figures under his breath. 320 tickets at varied prices. Refunds will be demanded. The hire of the hall alone, and the insurance. The insurance will not cover... He broke off when he saw me. Dr. Watson, are you with Mr. Holmes? When can these people leave? Every minute they stand here is another minute of liability I cannot afford. I asked him about the evening's arrangements. He confirmed that he had been moving between the front of house and the backstage area throughout the early part of the evening, coordinating lighting, seating, and the program notes. He had last been backstage at approximately 7:15 and had not returned to the stage area after that. Did you see Varn during your time backstage? Briefly. He was in the green room, composing himself, as he always did. I did not disturb him. And his demeanour? Hallberg waved a hand distractedly. Normal. Varn before a concert was always the same, quiet, focused, slightly imperious. Nothing unusual. He resumed his pacing, and I left him to his calculations. I found Holmes in the corridor between the stage and the lobby, standing in a doorway with his coat still damp from the rain, and his expression one of focused intensity. He had completed his initial examination of the stage, and he listened without interruption as I relayed the substance of my interviews. When I had finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he said, "The body was positioned, Watson, not collapsed. The distinction is critical. A man who dies at his instrument falls, forward, sideways, some direction dictated by gravity and the failure of muscular control. This man was upright, composed, arranged with care and attention to detail. Someone wanted 300 witnesses to believe they were watching a living performance." "But the silence," I said. "Surely that defeats the purpose of the illusion." "Does it? Consider. The silence confused the audience. It delayed their understanding. For 5 full minutes, 300 reasonably intelligent people sat in that hall and convinced themselves they were witnessing an artistic choice rather than a crime. 5 minutes, Watson. That is an eternity in the arithmetic of murder." He turned toward the lobby. "I need a complete list of every person who had backstage access this evening. Staff, performers, technicians, visitors, and I need the backstage logbook." He paused. "The usher's account of Klein, arriving at the front entrance at 7:42, slightly breathless, adjusting his cuffs. Oh, that is interesting." "More interesting than Moreau?" I asked. The man practically confessed his hatred. "Hatred is noisy, Watson. It draws attention to itself because it wishes to be seen. The most dangerous operations are conducted in silence." He glanced back toward the stage, where the single light still burned above the motionless figure at the piano. Rather like tonight's performance. Chapter 3. The Hands That Did Not Play. We returned to the stage at 9:15. The hall was emptying now. Lestrade had begun releasing the audience in small groups once Bradstreet had recorded their particulars, and the building had taken on the hollow, resonant quality of a large space recently vacated. Our footsteps echoed on the boards as we crossed from the wings to the centre of the platform, where the body of Elias Varn remained precisely as it had been, upright and still beneath the amber light. Holmes had sent a constable to Baker Street for his leather case of instruments, and it now sat open on the stage floor beside the piano bench. A compact kit containing his magnifying lens, a set of fine pointed tweezers, glass slides, paper envelopes, a small steel ruler, and a number of chemical reagents in stoppered vials. He removed his coat, rolled his shirt sleeves to the elbow, and approached the piano with the controlled deliberation of a surgeon entering an operating theatre. "Watson, stand here," he said, indicating a position to the left of the piano facing the keyboard. "I want you to observe the hands as I describe what I see. Your medical training will be useful, but so will your musical ear. Oh, you are a man who appreciates music, even if you do not perform it with any particular distinction." "Thank you," I said dryly. He did not acknowledge the remark. He was already leaning over the keyboard, his lens raised, his face inches from the dead man's fingers. "Note the position of the right hand," he said. "The fingers are extended across the keys, from approximately middle C to the G above. The thumb rests on C, the index finger on D, and so forth in a natural scalar position. At first glance, it is entirely convincing, a pianist's hand upon the keyboard poised to play. And at second glance, everything is wrong." He straightened and took my right hand, positioning it above the keys as he had done earlier. "Play a C major scale, slowly." I did so, pressing each key in sequence. I'm not a pianist. My instrument, such as it is, was the clarinet during my school days, but the basic action of depressing a piano key is within anyone's capacity. "Now stop," Holmes said. "Hold your hand as it is." I froze with my fingers curved over the keys, my ring finger depressing the A above middle C. "Look at your hand, Watson. What do you see?" I looked. My fingers were naturally curved, the knuckles slightly raised, the fingertips making contact with the keys at an angle. There was tension in my forearm, a subtle engagement of the muscles that connected the movement of the fingers to the weight of the hand and wrist above them. "Now, look at his." I looked at Varn's right hand. The difference, now that Holmes had taught me to see it, was stark. Where my fingers curved, his lay flat. Where my knuckles rose, his were level with the back of the hand. The fingers rested on the keys with no more tension than a glove draped across a table. There was no curvature, no muscular engagement, no sense of a living connection between the hand and the instrument. "A pianist's hand is never truly at rest upon the keys," Holmes said. "Even in a pause between passages, the fingers maintain their architecture, the curve, the readiness, the distribution of weight through the wrist and forearm. It is a posture trained into the musculature over decades. It persists even in sleep, even in death. I have observed pianists' hands in repose, and they retain the shadow of their art." He indicated the left hand, which was positioned in a similar scalar arrangement an octave lower. The same, flat, passive, placed with an understanding of where a pianist's fingers ought to be, but not how they ought to be. Whoever arranged these hands knew the geography of the keyboard, but not the physiology of the player. He took a step back and regarded the body from a greater distance. "Do you recall the chess-playing automaton, Watson? The Turk that astonished all of Europe?" "The mechanical figure that played chess against human opponents," I said. "It was exposed as a fraud, a man hidden inside the cabinet." "Precisely. A machine designed to simulate human intelligence, concealing the absence of the very thing it pretended to possess. Here we have the inverse, a human body arranged to simulate a performance, concealing the absence of life itself." He paused. "The Turk hid a man inside a machine. Our killer has hidden a machine inside a man. Or rather, inside his instrument." He moved to the piano itself and depressed the sustain pedal with his foot. Nothing happened. No resonance, no sympathetic vibration of the strings. He pressed a key, middle C. The hammer rose toward the string but produced no sound. He pressed another and another. Silence. "The instrument has been deliberately muted," he said. He lifted the lid of the piano, propping it open on its stand and leaned over the exposed interior. I joined him and looked down into the complex architecture of strings, hammers and dampers that constitutes the hidden machinery of a concert grand. "There," Holmes said, pointing with the tip of his tweezers. I saw it. Between the hammers and the strings, strips of dense felt had been wedged. Not the thin felt of the factory-installed dampers, but thicker material, darker in colour, cut into irregular rectangles and pressed firmly into position so that when a hammer struck, it met the felt barrier before reaching the string and produced no vibration at all. Holmes extracted one of the strips with his tweezers and held it to the light. It was perhaps 4 inches long, 1.5 inches wide and densely woven. The colour was a deep indigo blue. "Hand cut," he said, turning it between the steel points. "The edges are uneven. Scissors, not a factory die. And the adhesive..." He brought the strip to his nose, then touched the underside with the pad of his index finger. "Fish glue. Still tacky. This was applied recently, within the past day, perhaps less. Certainly not a permanent modification. This was done for tonight, and tonight only." He replaced the strip and examined several others along the length of the keyboard. All were of the same material, the same colour, affixed with the same adhesive. The entire range of the instrument had been silenced. "Someone went to considerable trouble," I said. "Considerable and methodical. There are 88 keys on this instrument, Watson. Each hammer must be individually dampened. The work would take," he calculated silently, "no less than 30 minutes for someone who knew precisely what they were doing. Far longer for an amateur. This was not improvised. This was planned." He lowered the lid carefully and turned his attention to the lower portion of the piano, the area beneath the keyboard concealed by a wooden panel. He knelt and examined the panel's edges with his lens, but did not open it. "There are scratch marks here," he said, tracing a line along the bottom edge of the panel with his finger. "Recent. The varnish has been disturbed. Someone has removed and replaced this panel more than once in the recent past. The screw heads show multiple engagement marks." He rocked back on his heels. "I shall want to examine the interior of this compartment, but not tonight. I require better light and my own tools. There is something behind this panel that was not placed there by the manufacturer." He stood and brushed the dust from his knees. For a long moment he looked down at the body of Elias Varn, at the composed face, the elegant evening dress, the hands so carefully and so wrongly positioned upon the keys. "Watson, do you recall the witness accounts you gathered? The music critic and the society lady? Cleeve and Lady Ashworth, yes. Cleeve described the key movement as immaculate, the correct tempo, the correct phrasing. Lady Ashworth said it was too even, like a metronome, like a music box." "She did. They are both right, and Lady Ashworth, despite her lack of technical vocabulary, has identified something crucial. A human pianist does not play with metronomic regularity. Even in the most precisely controlled performance, there are micro-variations, accelerations and decelerations so subtle that the conscious mind does not register them, but the ear perceives them as life. Rubato, the Italians call it. The breath of music. The freedom within discipline that distinguishes art from mechanism." He walked slowly around the piano, his hands clasped behind his back. "What 300 people watched tonight was not a performance. It was a demonstration. The keys moved with mechanical precision because they were driven by a mechanism, not by human hands. And the silence was not an artistic choice. The instrument was muted because the mechanism that drove the keys had no capacity for dynamic variation. Had the strings been free to sound, the audience would have heard not music, but a grotesque, rigid parody of it. The silence was necessary to preserve the illusion. Then the moving keys were driven from below, or from within. There is a device concealed inside this piano, Watson, and when I open that lower panel tomorrow morning, I expect to find it. But I can already tell you something about the person who installed it." "What is that?" "He is not a pianist. He is an engineer, a mechanic. a man who understands the internal architecture of this instrument the way a watchmaker understands the movement of a clock. The dampened hammers, the concealed mechanism, the careful positioning of the body, all of it speaks of someone with intimate technical knowledge of the piano as a machine, not as a musical instrument. A pianist thinks in terms of sound and feeling. This person thinks in terms of levers, hammers, and tolerances. He gathered his instruments and closed the leather case. I shall need samples of this felt for comparison. I have already taken cuttings from 2 of the dampening strips, and I have observed something else, a detail I wish to confirm with better equipment. What detail? The felt used to silence the hammers is the same material, the same colour, the same weave, the same weight as the standard damper cloth used inside the internal mechanism of concert grand pianos. It is a highly specialised material. It is not sold in shops. It is sourced directly from piano manufacturers and supplied only to technicians and restorers. Whoever did this had access to materials that an ordinary person, even an ordinary musician, would have no means of obtaining. He took one final look at the stage, the piano, the body, the single light burning above them like a vigil candle, and then turned toward the wings. Come, Watson, there is nothing more to be learned here tonight. Tomorrow I shall open the lower panel. Tonight I wish to think. We walked in silence through the backstage corridor. At the stage door, Holmes paused and asked the constable on duty for the backstage logbook. The man produced it, a simple ledger in which every person entering or exiting the backstage area was required to sign their name and record the time. Holmes studied it for several minutes, his eyes moving down the columns with rapid precision. I looked over his shoulder. The entries for that evening were sparse. Stage crew from 6 o'clock onward, Elias Varn arriving at 6:30, Edmund Klein signing in at 7:15 and out at 7:20. Clara Weiss in at 7 and out at 20 past. Hallberg making several entries between 6:30 and 7:15. Holmes closed the book and handed it back to the constable. "This man did not die here on this stage, Watson," he said as we stepped into the alley behind the hall. The rain had stopped, and the cobblestones glistened under a thin film of water that reflected the gaslight from the street beyond. He was brought here, carried or dragged from the green room, positioned at the instrument, and made to perform a grotesque pantomime for an audience that did not know it was watching a dead man. "Perfection is the enemy of artistry," I said, half to myself, recalling his earlier words. Holmes glanced at me. "And of deception," he said. The mechanism was too perfect. The silence gave it menace, but the precision gave it away. Whoever built this spectacle understood machinery but did not understand music. And that, Watson, is the thread we shall follow. He raised his hand for a cab. One appeared almost immediately, its lantern swaying in the damp air, and we climbed inside. "Baker Street," Holmes told the driver. He then said nothing more for the duration of the journey. He sat with his eyes closed and his fingertips pressed together, and I knew that behind that still exterior, the immense engine of his mind was already at work, sorting, connecting, discarding, building, constructing from the fragments of the evening, a structure that would, in time, reveal the face of a killer. Chapter 4. The Marks Upon the Neck. I slept poorly that night. The image of Elias Varn seated at his piano, upright, composed, and utterly lifeless, followed me into my dreams and distorted them. I woke twice before dawn, and when I finally rose at 7 o'clock, I found Holmes already dressed, standing at the window with a cup of coffee in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Watching the street below with the abstracted intensity of a man whose thoughts are very far from what his eyes observe. "You have not slept," I said. "I have not required sleep," he replied, which was not the same thing. "I've been considering the question of sequence. The murder was committed backstage, almost certainly in the green room. The body was then moved to the stage, positioned at the piano, and the mechanism activated. This sequence demands a window of time during which the backstage area was unoccupied by anyone other than the killer and the victim. According to the logbook, that window opened at 7:20, when the last recorded departure occurred, and closed at 7:50 when the curtain rose. 30 minutes, in which a man was strangled, dragged to the stage, arranged at the instrument, and the mechanism set in motion. It is tight, Watson, but it is sufficient, provided the killer had prepared everything in advance. The dampened hammers, the concealed device, the route from the green room to the stage. Nothing was left to improvisation. This was a performance in its own right, rehearsed as carefully as any concert. He crushed out his cigarette. I have sent a message to Lestrade requesting the presence of the police surgeon at Aeolian Hall at 9 o'clock. I wish to examine the body once more before it is removed, and I have a particular question for Dr. Enfield. We arrived at the hall to find Lestrade waiting with Dr. Enfield, a competent but unimaginative man whom I knew slightly from professional circles, since he had performed a preliminary examination the previous evening and had attributed death to cardiac failure, a diagnosis that, given Varn's age and known history of chest complaints, was not unreasonable on its face. Holmes wasted no courtesies. "Dr. Enfield, when you examined the body last night, did you inspect the neck?" Enfield blinked. "I examined the chest, the pupils, the colour of the skin. The presentation was consistent with sudden cardiac arrest. I did not find it necessary to—" "You did not inspect the neck," Holmes said. It was not a question. "Come." We followed him onto the stage. The body had not been moved. Holmes's insistence on this point had been absolute, and Lestrade, whatever his private reservations, had enforced it. Varn sat at the piano in the same attitude of false composure, the single stage light still burning above him, casting shadows that had deepened overnight as the ambient light from the windows faded and returned. Holmes positioned himself behind the body and gently tilted the head forward. Rigour had advanced since the previous evening, and the neck resisted slightly before yielding. Holmes held his lens to the skin beneath the jaw and along the sides of the throat, moving it slowly, systematically, from the angle of the mandible to the hollow above the clavicle. "Watson, come and look at this." I took the lens from him and examined the area he indicated, a band of skin approximately 2 inches wide, encircling the throat just above the collar line. At first glance there was little to see. The skin was pale, as one would expect in a corpse of some 14 hours, and there were no dramatic marks, no livid bruising, no rope burns, no cuts or abrasions of the kind associated with violent strangulation. But when I looked more closely, I saw what Holmes had seen. There was a faint discoloration, not the dark purple of deep bruising, but a subtle change in the tone of the skin. Slightly pink where the surrounding tissue was white, distributed in a broad, even band. It was the kind of mark that might be left by sustained pressure from something wide and soft. Not a rope or a wire, which would leave a narrow, well-defined furrow, but something that distributed its force across a broader surface. "Ligature strangulation," I said, "but with an unusual instrument, something soft, wide, pliable." "Precisely. A material that would compress the airway and the carotid arteries without tearing the skin or leaving the conspicuous marks that would alert even the most cursory medical examination." Holmes glanced at Enfield, who had the good grace to redden slightly. The killer chose his weapon with the same precision he applied to every other element of this crime. He wanted a death that could pass at first inspection for a natural cause. Holmes produced his tweezers from his breast pocket and leaned in once more. He worked in silence for several minutes, his breathing shallow, his movements infinitely delicate. When he straightened, the tweezers held something so small I could barely see it. A thread, perhaps 1/4 of an inch long, caught between the steel tips. "There are more," he said. "Embedded in the skin folds of the neck and caught in the weave of the collar fabric." He extracted 4 more fragments over the next 10 minutes, depositing each on a glass slide. When he had finished, he held one of the slides to the stage light and examined it through the lens. "Fibres," he said. "Textile fibres. Deep indigo blue, dense, tightly woven, with a short nap." He looked at me. "Does the colour suggest anything to you, Watson?" It did. I'd seen that precise shade of indigo blue the previous evening, in the strips of felt that had been wedged between the piano's hammers and its strings. The dampening material, I said. The felt from inside the piano. The same colour, the same apparent texture. I shall confirm under the microscope at Baker Street, but I have little doubt. The murder weapon was a strip of piano damper cloth, the same material used to silence the instrument. The killer strangled Varn with the very fabric of his art. He stepped back from the body and turned his attention to the broader physical evidence of death. He pressed the skin of the lower back firmly with 2 fingers, then released. Watson, observe. I looked. Where Holmes had pressed, the skin blanched white before slowly returning to a faint purplish hue. Posterior lividity, the settling of blood under gravity into the lowest portions of the body after death. In a man who had died seated upright at a piano, one would expect lividity in the buttocks and the backs of the thighs. But the pattern I observed was more generalized, extending across the lower back and the posterior surfaces of the upper arms in a distribution more consistent with a body that had lain supine, or perhaps slumped in a chair, for some time before being moved to its current position. He was not sitting at this piano when he died, I said. No, he was moved here afterward. The lividity tells us that the body remained in a different position, likely in the green room, where we found the displaced chair, for a period after death before being transported to the stage. Holmes then examined the jaw and the small joints of the fingers. Rigor mortis had progressed significantly since the previous evening, but Holmes was interested in the state of rigor as it had been when we first arrived. You will recall, he said, that last night the jaw showed early stiffness, and there was detectable rigidity in the fingers. Rigor typically begins in the smaller muscles of the face and hands within 2 to 3 hours of death and progresses to the larger muscle groups over the following 6 to 12. The degree of rigor we observed last night, at approximately 8:30, was consistent with death having occurred no later than 7:30, I said, following his reasoning. Possibly earlier. I would place it between 7:30 and 7:40, Holmes said. A full 15 to 20 minutes before the curtain rose at 7:50. The audience was watching a man who had been dead for a quarter of an hour. He turned to Lestrade, who had been listening from the wings with his notebook open. Inspector, you may release the body to Doctor Enfield for a full post-mortem examination. But I will tell you now what he will find. Death by asphyxiation due to ligature compression of the airway and the carotid arteries, affected by a strip of dense fabric approximately 2 inches in width. The cardiac history is coincidental, not causative. This man was murdered. Lestrade closed his notebook. Murdered and then put on display. Yes, and therein lies the particular cruelty of it. The killer did not merely end this man's life. He made his death into a spectacle, a performance for an audience that did not know what it was watching. There is a mind behind this crime that takes pleasure not only in the act, but in the theatre of it. We left the stage and made our way to the backstage area. Holmes had visited the green room briefly the previous evening, but now he examined it with the unhurried thoroughness that characterized his most serious investigations. The room was small, a dressing area with a mirror, a clothes rail, a washstand, and 2 upholstered chairs. A framed playbill from a previous season hung on the wall beside the mirror. Holmes moved through the space in a slow, systematic pattern, beginning at the door and working inward. He examined the floor on his hands and knees, the carpet pile pressed flat in places, scuffed and disturbed in others. Near the door he found a mark on the baseboard, a black scuff at ankle height, consistent with the toe of a shoe striking the wood. The body was dragged from this room, he said, feet first. The killer grasped the body beneath the arms and pulled it backward through the door and along the corridor to the stage wing. The scuff mark is from Varn's shoe catching the baseboard as the body was manoeuvred through the doorway. He followed the route from the green room along the backstage corridor to the stage wing, a distance of perhaps 40 feet. At intervals he found faint parallel marks on the floor, the drag traces of heels drawn across a surface too hard to retain a full impression, but soft enough to show disturbance under the oblique light of his lantern. In the green room itself, one of the chairs had been displaced, pushed back from its usual position, its rear legs leaving shallow indentations in the carpet that did not align with the deeper marks of its customary placement. On the wall behind the chair, at a height of approximately 5 feet, there was a faint pressure mark on the plaster, a smudge, barely visible, where something or someone had pressed against the surface. "He killed Varn in this room," Holmes said. "Varn was seated in this chair. The killer approached from behind, looped the cloth around his throat, and pulled. Varn's body was pressed back against the chair, and the killer braced himself against the wall behind to maintain leverage. The pressure mark corresponds to a shoulder or an elbow. The displaced chair shows the force of the struggle. Brief, I suspect, given the efficiency of the ligature. 2 minutes, perhaps less, and it was done." He stood in the centre of the room and looked around him one final time. A man sat in this room and waited for his concert to begin. He was alone, or believed himself to be, and someone he knew, someone whose presence backstage would have aroused no suspicion whatever, came to him, stood behind him, and ended his life with a strip of cloth taken from the interior of his own piano. I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since the previous evening. "Holmes, do you know who?" He did not answer immediately. He walked to the door of the green room and looked down the corridor toward the stage, where the constable still stood guard. "I know what kind of man," he said at last. "I know his skills, his materials, and his methods. I know that he was in this building after he claimed to have left it. I know that he possesses knowledge of the piano's interior that no ordinary person could have. But suspicion is not proof, Watson, and the distance between knowing and demonstrating is the space in which justice either lives or dies." He pulled his coat from the rack where he had hung it. "Come, I have work to do at Baker Street. The fibres require microscopic examination, and tomorrow morning I shall return here with my own tools and open the lower panel of that piano. I believe it has one more secret to surrender." Chapter 5. The Piano Secret. Holmes was gone before I woke the following morning. Mrs. Hudson informed me that he had taken a cab at 6:30, carrying his leather instrument case and a canvas roll of tools she did not recognize. He had left no message, which meant either that he expected me to follow or that he did not require my presence. With Holmes, the distinction was often a matter of temperament rather than intention, and I had long since learned to err on the side of attendance. I arrived at Aeolian Hall shortly after 8 o'clock to find the main doors locked and a single constable posted at the stage entrance in the alley. He admitted me without difficulty. Lestrade had left instructions, and I made my way through the now familiar backstage corridor to the stage. Holmes was already at work. He had removed his jacket and waistcoat and rolled his sleeves above the elbow, and he knelt before the grand piano with the lower panel removed and set aside against the stage wall. A portable oil lamp had been placed on the floor beside him, its flame adjusted to cast a steady, concentrated light into the exposed interior of the instrument. His canvas roll lay open nearby, revealing an array of tools I had never seen him use before. Fine-pointed screwdrivers, a jeweller's loop on a brass stand, a set of calipers, and several implements whose purpose I could not identify. He did not look up when I approached. "You are just in time, Watson. I have found it." I crouched beside him and looked into the space beneath the keyboard. The interior of a grand piano below the level of the keys and hammers is a region of braced wooden framing, iron supports, and the heavy cast iron plate that anchors the strings under their enormous collective tension. It is not a space designed for concealment, and to an untrained eye it would appear to offer no room for anything that did not belong there. But Holmes's lamp revealed something that emphatically did not belong. Bolted to the underside of the key mechanism, partially hidden behind a crossbrace, was a compact apparatus of brass, steel, and leather. It was perhaps 18 inches long, 8 inches wide, and no more than 4 inches deep, a flat, densely constructed device that had been fitted into the available space with extraordinary precision. as though it had been measured and built specifically for this instrument. A pneumatic player mechanism, Holmes said. Not a commercial device. Nothing of this size exists on the market. This was built by hand to specification for the express purpose of fitting inside this particular piano without detection. He directed my attention to the mechanism's components, a series of thin steel rods extended upward from the device, each one connected to the underside of a piano key. A leather bellows, operated by a small clockwork motor, provided the pneumatic pressure that drove the rods in sequence. The sequence itself was governed by a perforated paper roll, similar in principle to the rolls used in player pianos, but narrower, more compact, and hand-punched rather than commercially produced. The paper roll contains the encoded performance, Holmes said. Each perforation corresponds to a key depression. The clockwork motor turns the roll at a constant speed. The bellows provides pressure, and the rods push the keys upward from below. The effect, viewed from the audience, would be indistinguishable from a living pianist's fingers depressing the keys, provided one did not look too closely at the fingers themselves. The silence, I said, the dampened hammers. Essential to the deception, the mechanism drives the keys with mechanical regularity, no variation in force, no dynamic shading, no rubato. If the strings had been free to sound, the audience would have heard a performance of grotesque rigidity. The music would have been recognizable, but it would have been immediately apparent that no human hand was producing it. By silencing the hammers, the killer eliminated the acoustic evidence of artificiality. The audience saw the keys move and heard nothing, and their confusion over the silence prevented them from questioning the movement itself. He reached into the mechanism's interior with a pair of long-nosed pliers and carefully extracted the paper roll. He unspooled a portion of it and held it to the lamplight. The perforations were tiny, precise, and arranged in patterns that, to my untrained eye, resembled nothing so much as the punched cards used in jacquard looms. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Holmes said, after reading the perforations as easily as I might read a line of printed text. Opus 9, number 2, the piece Varn was scheduled to perform as his opening number. The killer encoded the correct piece. He wanted the movement of the keys to correspond to the program, so that any musician in the audience who watched the fingers would see them moving in the right pattern for the right composition. The attention to detail is remarkable. He set the paper roll aside and turned his attention to the brass fittings that secured the mechanism to the piano's frame. There were 6 of them, small hexagonal bolts, each approximately 1/4 of an inch in diameter, recessed into counter-sunk holes in the wooden bracing. Holmes examined each one through the jeweller's loupe, spending several minutes on each bolt before moving to the next. These fittings were installed with a specialized tool, he said. The bolt heads are hexagonal, but not a standard size. They are slightly oversized, approximately 7/16 of an inch across the flats, where a standard bolt of this diameter would be 3/8. This means the wrench used to drive them was also non-standard, and the tool marks confirm it. He adjusted the loop and invited me to look. I saw, on the flat faces of the bolt heads, faint scratches, the kind of marks left when a wrench slips slightly during tightening. The scratches were parallel, evenly spaced, and consistent across all 6 bolts. The same tool was used on every fitting, Holmes said, and the configuration of the marks tells me 2 things. First, the wrench head was hexagonal with slightly rounded internal corners, a design that grips the bolt more securely, but leaves a characteristic pattern when it slips. Second, the wrench was used by a right-handed man, applying force in a clockwise direction with a forearm rotation rather than a wrist turn. This is a technique specific to piano technicians who must work in confined spaces where a full wrist rotation is impossible. He sat back on his heels and wiped his hands on a cloth. The mechanism was installed over multiple visits, Watson. The scratch patterns on the screw heads of the lower panel show at least 4 separate removals and replacements. Each time the panel was taken off, work was performed inside, and the panel was refitted. The varnish around the panel edges has been progressively worn down. The earlier scratches show lacquer displacement, while the most recent show bare wood. I estimate the installation took place over a period of 2 to 3 weeks, during which time the piano was here, on the stage, or in the hall's instrument storage room, which is accessible from the backstage corridor. The mechanism required someone with unrestricted backstage access, specialized tools, intimate knowledge of this specific instrument's dimensions and construction, and the leisure to work on it repeatedly without arousing suspicion. He began to reassemble the lower panel, replacing the screws but leaving them finger-tight rather than fully driven. "I am preserving the tool marks for evidence," he explained. "When I find the wrench that made them, the match will be conclusive." We returned to Baker Street by 10:30. Holmes went directly to the chemical table by the window, where his microscope and reagent bottles were arranged with the fastidious order that characterized his scientific equipment, however chaotic the rest of the room might be. He placed one of the glass slides from the previous day, the fibers extracted from Varn's neck, under the lens, and spent 20 minutes in silent examination, adjusting the focus, rotating the slide, and occasionally consulting a reference volume on textile manufacture that he pulled from the shelf above his desk. When he straightened, his expression held the quiet satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. "The fibers from the neck are piano damper cloth," he said. "Specifically, they are woven wool felt with an indigo dye, consistent with the type manufactured by Röslau and Söhne in Bavaria, the standard supplier of internal damper components to the major concert piano builders, including Bechstein. The fibers are identical in color, weave density and dye composition to the strips used to silence the hammers. The same material, almost certainly from the same source. When I examined the piano's interior this morning, I noted that a section of the internal damper lining, the felt strip that normally sits against the strings to prevent unwanted resonance when the damper pedal is not engaged, had been cut away. A rectangular piece, approximately 24 inches long and 2 inches wide. The cut was clean, made with a sharp blade, and the dimensions correspond precisely to the width and probable length of a ligature sufficient to encircle a man's throat. He filled his pipe and lit it, leaning against the mantelpiece. The picture is now substantially complete, though one critical piece of physical evidence remains outstanding: the tool. Let me summarize what we know. He spoke with the measured precision of a man laying out the components of a machine on a workbench, each piece in its proper order. First, Elias Varn was strangled in the green room of Aeolian Hall at approximately 7:35 on the evening of the concert. The murder weapon was a strip of damper cloth cut from the interior of his own piano. Second, the body was moved to the stage and positioned at the instrument, the hands arranged on the keys to simulate a living performance. Third, a concealed pneumatic mechanism, hand-built and installed over a period of weeks, was activated to drive the keys in the pattern of the scheduled program. Fourth, the piano's hammers had been dampened with the same material to ensure silence, preventing the mechanical regularity of the mechanism from betraying the deception. He drew on his pipe. This crime was committed by a person with unrestricted access to the piano over a period of weeks, specialized knowledge of the instrument's internal construction, the technical skill to design and install a bespoke pneumatic mechanism, access to materials, damper cloth, fish glue, period-appropriate tools, available only to professional piano technicians, and the physical presence backstage on the evening of the murder during the critical window between 7:20 and 7:50. Watson suggested the name that had been in the forefront of my mind since the previous evening: Moreau. He had the motive, professional jealousy carried to an extreme. He was in the building. Moreau is a pianist, Watson. He thinks in terms of sound, interpretation, and expression. The person who committed this crime thinks in terms of mechanisms, tolerances, and materials. Moreover, Moreau was seated in the third row of the auditorium from 7:30 onward, confirmed by a dozen witnesses. He could not have committed the murder at 7:35 and been in his seat at 7:30. Then who? Holmes did not answer directly. He crossed to the window and looked out at the street, so where a hansom was passing slowly through the afternoon traffic. "There is a name I have not yet spoken aloud," he said, "because suspicion without evidence is the refuge of the lazy mind. But I will tell you this. The answer to who killed Elias Varn is contained not in who hated him most visibly, but in who needed him to remain silent most urgently. Hatred is a luxury, Watson. Desperation is a motive." He turned from the window. "Tomorrow we begin the interviews. 5 people had backstage access on the night of the murder. One of them killed Elias Varn, and I believe I know which one, but I must prove it with iron, not intuition." Chapter 6. 5 people backstage. The interviews began the following morning and consumed the better part of 2 days. Holmes conducted them with a patience that surprised me. He was not, by nature, or a patient man, and his usual method of interrogation favoured the swift, surgical question over the extended conversation. But in this case, he seemed content to let each subject talk at length, guiding the discourse with a light hand, allowing silences to do the work that direct questions could not. We began with Edmund Klein. His workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on Seckford Street in Clerkenwell, a district I knew by reputation as the historic home of London's clockmakers and precision craftsmen. The street was quiet, lined with modest brick-fronted buildings whose ground floors housed workshops and whose upper stories served as residences. The air smelled of machine oil and wood shavings, and from behind several closed doors came the faint rhythmic sounds of industry, the tapping of small hammers, the whir of lathes, the patient labour of men who worked with their hands. Klein met us at his door and admitted us with every appearance of cooperative grief. He was a man of perhaps 50, solidly built, with thinning grey hair, and the kind of face that was difficult to remember 5 minutes after leaving his company. Pleasant, unremarkable, designed by nature or by habit to make no strong impression. His hands, however, were extraordinary. I noticed them the moment he extended one in greeting. Broad, powerful, with thick fingers and heavy calluses on the pads of the thumb and the first 2 fingers of each hand. The calluses were not the soft thickenings of a writer or a clerk, but the hard, ridged formations of a man who gripped specialized tools under sustained pressure. His workshop was immaculate. Tools hung on pegboards in precise rows, arranged by size and function. A workbench ran the length of one wall, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. In the centre of the room stood a piano with its case removed, exposing the full complexity of its interior. Strings, hammers, dampers, and the heavy iron frame, like an anatomical model with the skin pulled back. "A dreadful business," Klein said, seating us in chairs that had clearly been brought in for the occasion. "I have known Elias for 14 years. I have tuned and maintained every instrument he has played in London during that time. He trusted me absolutely." His voice was steady, his grief measured and controlled, the sorrow of a professional man who understood the value of composure. Holmes expressed his sympathies and then began, as was his custom, with questions that seemed peripheral. He asked about the history of the Backstein at Aeolian Hall, when it had been acquired, how often it was serviced, what particular characteristics it possessed. Klein answered readily, with the fluency of a man discussing his area of deepest expertise. "I performed the final tuning on the evening of the concert," Klein said. "I arrived at 6:45, as the logbook shows, and worked for approximately 30 minutes. The instrument was in excellent condition. I made minor adjustments to the upper register. The hammers in that range had hardened slightly, which is normal with heavy use, and verified the pedal action. I signed out at 7:20 and went home to change for the performance." "You attended the concert as a member of the audience?" "I always do. when Elias performs. Yet professional interest and personal loyalty. A pause. I arrived at the front entrance at approximately 7:15. The usher will confirm this. Holmes nodded. Mr. Klein, the piano was found to contain certain modifications. Specifically, the hammers had been dampened with felt strips affixed with fish glue, and there was a mechanical device concealed beneath the key action. Could these modifications have been present during your tuning without your knowledge? Klein's expression shifted, not dramatically but perceptibly, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional straightening of the posture. The dampened hammers? No, I inspected every hammer during the tuning. They were not dampened at that time. If such a modification was made, it was made after I left. And the mechanical device? I did not inspect the lower panel. There would be no reason to during a routine tuning. It is conceivable that something was already installed there without my knowledge, but it would require extraordinary skill and access. The person who did such a thing would need years of training. He paused, then added, with an emphasis that seemed almost rehearsed, years of training and an intimate understanding of that specific instrument. Holmes let the statement settle. Then he asked casually, as though the thought had only just occurred to him, "Is there anyone, apart from yourself, who possesses that level of familiarity with the Aeolian Hall Bechstein?" Klein considered. There are perhaps a dozen technicians in London capable of working on a concert grand at the highest level. But intimacy with a specific instrument, knowing its tolerances, its idiosyncrasies, the precise clearances within its case, that comes only from sustained personal attention. I would say that I am the only person in London who knows that piano as well as I do. Holmes thanked him and rose. At the door, he turned back. "One more question, Mr. Klein. Your tools, I notice they are custom-made. The wrench on the second pegboard, for instance. The hexagonal head appears to be a non-standard size." Klein glanced at the tool in question, a heavy steel wrench with a T-shaped handle and a hexagonal socket head. "I designed it myself," he said, and for the first time a note of genuine pride entered his voice. "Standard wrenches do not fit the tuning pins of every manufacturer equally. I had this one made to my specifications by a toolmaker in Sheffield. The head is 7/16 across the flats, slightly oversized with rounded internal corners for a more secure grip. There is not another like it in London." "Fascinating," Holmes said, and we left. In the cab, Holmes said nothing for several minutes. Then, "He is very good, Watson, very controlled. He answered every question with precision and apparent candour. He volunteered the information about his unique wrench without hesitation, which means either that he is innocent and has nothing to hide, or that he is guilty and has calculated that denying ownership of a tool that half the piano world knows he possesses would be more suspicious than acknowledging it." We called next upon Clara Weiss at her lodgings in South Kensington, 2 modest rooms above a milliner's shop, furnished with the spare economy of a young woman living on a student's allowance. A hired upright piano stood against one wall, its surface covered with sheet music. Clara was calmer than she had been on the night of the murder, but her composure was fragile and it cracked twice during our interview. She confirmed her account. She had arrived backstage at 7:00 to wish Varn well before the performance, as was her custom. She had found him in the green room, seated in one of the chairs, but he had been distracted and uncommunicative. "He barely acknowledged me," she said. "He was reading a letter, or rereading it. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket when I came in. I asked if he was well. He said he was. I told him I would be in the audience. He nodded. I left at 7:20. Holmes asked about the argument outside the Kensington Café, the incident witnessed 3 days before the concert. Clara's composure broke. "It was not what people think," she said. "They assume it was a lover's quarrel. It was nothing of the kind. Elias was leaving London. He had accepted a position at the Vienna Conservatory. He was going to leave, and he was not going to recommend me to another teacher or write a letter of introduction. 3 years of study, and he considered my talent insufficient to merit even that small courtesy." She wiped her eyes fiercely. "I said he would regret how he had treated me. I meant professionally. I meant that I would prove him wrong. I did not mean I would never. Holmes assured her gently that she was not under suspicion, and asked whether she had any knowledge of piano mechanics or construction. She shook her head. I can barely tune my own instrument. Elias always said I had the ears of a poet and the practical skills of a child. Leon Moreau received us at his rooms in Marylebone with undisguised irritation. He was pacing when we arrived and did not sit down during the entirety of the interview, moving instead between the window and the fireplace, with the restless energy of a man perpetually dissatisfied with his surroundings. His alibi was, as before, unassailable. He had been seated in the third row from 7:30 onward, surrounded by witnesses. He had not been backstage at any point during the evening. His motive, professional rivalry, was real, but, as Holmes had already observed, it was the wrong kind of motive for this crime. Holmes, in the course of conversation, asked a question that appeared entirely innocent. The Chopin Nocturne that Varn was to perform, Opus 9, No. 2. There is a passage in the second section, a descending chromatic run in the right hand, that is notoriously difficult to execute with the proper delicacy. How would you approach it? Moreau began to answer, and then stopped. His right hand, which had been gesturing as he spoke, trembled visibly. He lowered it to his side and gripped the fabric of his trousers. I would approach it as any competent pianist would, he said, but the authority had drained from his voice. Holmes did not press. He thanked Moreau, and we left. In the cab, he said, Moreau's right hand has an intermittent tremor. He is concealing it from his manager, from the press, from everyone. His career is ending, Watson, and he knows it. His hostility toward Varn was the bitterness of a man watching his own abilities desert him while a rival flourished. But he is not our killer. He lacks the technical knowledge, the physical access, and, most importantly, the motive of desperation. Moreau is dying professionally. He is not killing professionally. Hallberg we found at his offices near Piccadilly, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, a man visibly drowning in the financial consequences of the disaster. His interview was brief and revealing, not of murder, but of fraud. Holmes's questions about the concert series finances produced increasingly desperate evasions, and by the end Hallberg was mopping his brow with a handkerchief and speaking in half-sentences. The ticket revenues, certain adjustments were necessary, short-term borrowing against future receipts. I assure you every penny will be accounted for. Holmes cut him short. Mr. Hallberg, you have been embezzling from the concert series to service personal debts. That is a matter for the financial courts, and does not concern me today. What concerns me is whether Elias Varn was aware of the discrepancies. Hallberg sagged. I feared he was. He was meticulous about contracts. He had asked to see the accounts twice in the past month. I put him off both times. Then Varn's death benefits you. It delays the exposure of your fraud. I suppose it does. But I did not kill him, Mr. Holmes. I am a weak man, not a violent one. Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you. You are guilty, Mr. Hallberg, but not of murder. Your motive ran in the wrong direction. A cancelled concert ruins you. A successful one buys you time. You needed Varn alive. Our final interview was with Dorothea Varn, whom we visited at the family home in Kensington. She received us in a drawing room of considerable elegance, dressed in mourning black, and conducted herself with a composure that I might have admired had it not seemed so thoroughly rehearsed. She confirmed her late arrival at the concert, approximately 7:48, and attributed it to a broken carriage wheel on the Brompton Road. Holmes listened, nodded, and asked no further questions about the delay. Instead, he complimented her gloves, which were new, expensively made, and scented with a subtle cologne. A gift, she said, and offered nothing further. Holmes did not pursue it. When we had left, he said, The cologne on her gloves is Penhaligon's Hammam Bouquet, a masculine scent. Her late arrival was not caused by a broken carriage wheel. She was with someone she cannot publicly acknowledge. Her evasiveness is the evasiveness of a woman concealing an affair, not a murder. That evening, Holmes obtained the Backstage logbook from Lestrade and examined it once more at Baker Street, cross-referencing every entry against the timeline we had established. He also interviewed, by telegram and subsequent visit, the charwoman who had been cleaning the second-floor offices on the night of the concert, a Mrs. Cutler, a reliable woman of 60 who had worked at Aeolian Hall for 9 years. Mrs. Cutler confirmed that she had been mopping the corridor outside the administrative offices at approximately 7:30 when she heard footsteps in the Backstage corridor directly below her. The footsteps were deliberate, unhurried and heavy, a man's tread. She had thought nothing of it at the time, assuming it was a stagehand. "The time, Mrs. Cutler? You're certain?" "I am, sir. The half-hour bell for the performance had just sounded. I always note it because it tells me I have 30 minutes before the interval, when I must have the lobby lavatories prepared." Holmes thanked her and returned to Baker Street in a state of focused silence. He sat in his armchair with the logbook open on his knee and his eyes fixed on the middle distance. "Klein signed out at 7:20, he said at last. "He claims he went home to change and returned through the front entrance at 7:42. The usher confirms the front entrance arrival. But Mrs. Cutler heard footsteps backstage at 7:35, 15 minutes after Klein supposedly left the building." He closed the logbook. "He did not leave Watson. He signed out, concealed himself somewhere backstage, and remained in the building. The footsteps Mrs. Cutler heard were his, moving from his hiding place to the green room where Varn sat alone, reading a letter he would never finish." Chapter 7. The Forger's Trail. Holmes did not speak of the case for the remainder of that evening. He sat in his armchair with his pipe until the fire burned low, and when I retired at 11 o'clock he was still there, motionless, wreathed in smoke, his gaze fixed on some interior landscape I could not access. I'd seen him in this state before, the deep sustained concentration that preceded his most decisive movements, and I knew better than to disturb it. When I came down the following morning, he was standing at the breakfast table with his coat already on, buttering a piece of toast with one hand and holding a folded sheet of paper in the other. "Watson, do you recall Clara Weiss's account of her visit to the green room?" "She said Varn was reading a letter. He put it in his coat pocket when she entered." "Precisely. And that coat, Varn's evening coat, was among the personal effects collected from the body and held by Lestrade at Scotland Yard. I sent a note to the inspector last night, requesting access to those effects. His reply arrived 20 minutes ago." He held up the folded sheet. "He has granted permission. We leave immediately. At Scotland Yard, a sergeant led us to a storeroom where the dead man's possessions had been catalogued and placed in a wooden tray. There was little of note: a pocket watch, a pair of reading spectacles in a leather case, a handkerchief, a programme for the evening's concert, and the evening coat itself, folded neatly at one end of the tray." Holmes took the coat and examined it with the methodical thoroughness he applied to every piece of evidence. He turned out the exterior pockets first, empty, and then ran his fingers along the interior lining. His hand paused at the left breast pocket and then moved lower, pressing the fabric between thumb and forefinger. "There is something in the lining," he said, "not in the pocket itself, below it. The pocket has a small tear at its lower seam, and whatever Varn placed there has slipped through into the space between the lining and the outer cloth." He produced a penknife, and with Lestrade's permission opened the lining along the existing tear. From the narrow gap he withdrew a single sheet of paper, folded twice, slightly creased from its confinement. It was a letter, written in a precise continental hand on cream-coloured stationery. The letterhead bore a Viennese address, and the name Herr Friedrich Schreiber. Holmes read it aloud. "Dear Mr. Varn, I write to express my profound gratitude for the magnificent Clementi manuscript, which arrived safely last month. The sonata in B-flat major is a treasure, and its provenance, attested by your name and reputation, places it among the finest acquisitions of my collection. I hope we may do business again. I would be particularly interested in any works by Dussek or the lesser-known contemporaries of Mozart. Should such items come to your attention, with warmest regards, Friedrich Schreiber. Holmes turned the letter over. On the reverse, in a different hand, angular, hurried, unmistakably English, Varn had written 2 words in pencil. K. How long? Holmes held the letter to the light and examined the paper, the ink and the watermark. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. K, I said. Klein. The initial admits of that interpretation, but let us not leap. Let us follow. He turned to Lestrade. Inspector, I require access to Varn's private study at his Kensington residence, and I shall need you to arrange an interview, discreet and not at Scotland Yard, with a rare manuscripts dealer in Bloomsbury named Alistair Hargrove. We went first to Kensington. Dorothea Varn was not at home. The housekeeper informed us she had gone to her sister's in Hampstead, but Lestrade's warrant gained us entry to the study, a large, well-appointed room on the first floor overlooking the garden. The study was the room of a man who loved music not merely as a performer, but as a scholar. 3 walls were lined with bookshelves containing volumes on musical history, theory, and biography. A glass-fronted cabinet held a collection of rare musical manuscripts, sheets of handwritten notation, yellowed with age, each one mounted in an archival frame and labelled with the composer's name, the work's title, and the date of acquisition. Holmes examined the cabinet with care. It contained 23 framed manuscripts, but the mounting hooks and the faint rectangular outlines of dust on the cabinet's velvet lining told a different story. There are spaces for 30, Holmes said. 7 are missing. The hooks are present but empty, and the dust patterns show that items were displayed here for an extended period before being removed. He consulted a leather-bound catalogue he found in the desk drawer, Varn's personal record of his collection, maintained in meticulous detail. Each entry included the composer, the work, the date of acquisition, the provenance, and the price paid. Holmes cross-referenced the catalogue against the cabinet's contents and identified the 7 missing items: 3 Clementi sonatas, 2 Dussek concerto fragments, a Hummel rondo, and a short piece attributed to a minor contemporary of Mozart named Johann Schobert. 7 manuscripts, acquired over a period of 12 years, with a combined catalogue value of approximately £600, Holmes said, all removed from the cabinet, none listed as sold, donated, or transferred in the catalogue. Varn was meticulous. If he had disposed of them legitimately, the transaction would be recorded here. He closed the catalogue. Now, the Schreiber letter thanks Varn for selling him a Clementi manuscript, but Varn did not sell it. His catalogue shows no such transaction. Someone sold a Clementi manuscript using Varn's name and reputation as provenance, and Varn, upon receiving this letter, wrote 2 words. K. How long? He was not asking who. He was asking how long it had been going on. We took a cab to Bloomsbury, where Lestrade had arranged for us to meet Alistair Hargrove at a tea-room on Great Russell Street, opposite the British Museum. Hargrove was a small, precise man with a neatly trimmed beard and the careful manners of someone who dealt in objects of great value and cultivated an air of scholarly discretion to match. He did not know Holmes by sight, and Lestrade had introduced us under assumed names, Holmes as a private collector, myself as his secretary. Holmes played the role with effortless conviction. He expressed interest in 18th century keyboard works, Clementi, Dussek, the lesser-known figures of the classical period. Hargrove's eyes brightened. "You have chosen a fascinating area of collection," Hargrove said, "and a timely one. I have, in recent years, had access to an exceptional private source, a gentleman connected to one of the finest collections in London. The provenance is unimpeachable. The name of Elias Varn is attached to each piece." Varn himself was the seller, Holmes asked with perfectly calibrated surprise. Not directly. The transactions were conducted through an intermediary, a gentleman who represented himself as acting on Varn's behalf. A discreet arrangement, as is common in the trade. Collectors of Varn's stature prefer not to be seen selling. "Can you describe this intermediary?" Hargrove considered. a man of middle years, solidly built, quiet in manner, with the hands of a craftsman rather than a scholar. He was knowledgeable about the manuscripts. He could speak to the paper, the ink, the binding techniques, with an authority that went beyond mere salesmanship. He dealt under the name of Mercer, though I suspected it was not his real name. "And how many transactions have you conducted with this Mr. Mercer?" 7, over a period of approximately 3 years. The total value... Hargrove paused, perhaps sensing that he was venturing into territory where discretion was advisable. The total value was considerable, in excess of £4,000. Holmes maintained his composure, but I saw the faintest tightening of his jaw. £4,000 was an enormous sum, sufficient to purchase a house in a respectable London neighbourhood, or to sustain a man of modest habits for a decade. He asked one more question. "The manuscripts you acquired from Mr. Mercer, do you have them still?" 3 I have sold on to collectors in Vienna, Paris and Edinburgh. 4 remain in my inventory. I can make them available for inspection. If you wish." Holmes thanked him warmly, promised to return, and we departed. Outside, in the thin October sunlight, he dropped the mask of the collector and became himself again. Sharp, focused, his mind moving at a speed that his body could barely contain. 7 forged manuscripts sold through Hargrove over 3 years for a combined total exceeding £4,000, he said. The intermediary matches Klein's build and manner. The manuscripts correspond exactly to the 7 items missing from Varn's cabinet. Klein had access to the originals through his professional relationship with Varn. He was in and out of that house for 14 years, tuning pianos, maintaining instruments, and all the while studying the manuscripts in the glass cabinet. He produced replicas using period-appropriate materials, sold them through Hargrove under a false name, and used Varn's reputation as the guarantee of authenticity. And Varn discovered the scheme. Through the Schreiber letter, a collector in Vienna wrote to thank him for a manuscript he had never sold. Varn confronted Klein. That is the meaning of the marginal note. K. How long? He wanted to know the extent of the betrayal, and he told Klein that he intended to make a public statement after the Aeolian Hall performance, exposing the forgeries and severing their association. We walked in silence for a moment. The traffic of Bloomsbury flowed around us. Cabs, omnibuses, men in bowler hats and women with parasols, all engaged in the ordinary commerce of a London afternoon, none of them aware that 2 men on the pavement were tracing the outline of a murder. Klein faced criminal prosecution, I said. The forgeries alone would mean prison, and the professional destruction. No one in the musical world would trust him again. Precisely. This was not a crime of passion, Watson. This was a crime of preservation. Klein had built his life, his reputation, his livelihood, his financial security, on a foundation of fraud, and Varn was about to pull the foundation away. The concert was the deadline. After that night, Varn would speak, and Klein's world would end. He stopped at the curb and turned to face me, so Klein decided that Varn's world would end first, and he did it with the instrument they both loved, the piano that connected them. That was the basis of their professional relationship, that Klein understood more intimately than any other object in his life. He killed Varn with a strip of the piano's own fabric, silenced the instrument with its own materials, and animated it with a mechanism of his own design. It was not merely murder, Watson. It was a kind of composition, a final performance, written and staged by the one man who understood every component of the machine. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "You admire him," I said. Holmes's expression hardened. "I recognize his ability. That is not the same thing. A man who strangles his colleague and turns his corpse into a marionette deserves recognition of his ingenuity only insofar as it illuminates the depth of his depravity." He raised his hand for a cab. "But suspicion, however well-founded, is not evidence. We need the tool, Watson, the wrench. Until I can match the tool marks on the mechanism's fittings to Klein's custom wrench, I have a theory. When I have the match, I have a case. Chapter 8. The Tool That Speaks. Holmes spent the evening in a state of focused preparation that reminded me more than anything of a general planning the final advance of a campaign. He sat at his desk with a sheet of foolscap before him and wrote in his small, precise hand, not notes on the case, which he kept entirely in his head, but a series of communications. A telegram to Lestrade requesting a search warrant for Klein's workshop, to be executed the following morning. A second telegram to Lestrade requesting that Klein be summoned to Scotland Yard at 10 o'clock for what was to be described as routine follow-up questioning, a pretext to ensure his absence from Seckford Street during the search. A third communication, hand-delivered by the page boy Billy to a locksmith in Holborn, whom Holmes had employed on previous occasions, and whose discretion was absolute. "Is the locksmith necessary?" I asked. "Lestrade's warrant should gain us entry." "The warrant gains us legal entry. The locksmith gains us efficient entry. Klein's workshop is his sanctuary, Watson. A man who builds concealed mechanisms inside concert pianos does not leave his own premises unsecured. I anticipate at least one lock that will resist a constable's shoulder. And I do not wish to waste time on brute force when finesse will serve." He sealed the letters and rang for Mrs. Hudson. When the arrangements were confirmed, he returned to his armchair and filled his pipe. "There is one element of this case that troubles me," he said, "and it is not the evidence that I believe will be conclusive. It is the psychology. Klein has had 3 days since the murder to dispose of incriminating materials. The forged manuscripts, the specialized papers and inks, the tools of his secondary trade. A rational man would have destroyed them. A bonfire in the workshop stove would eliminate everything in an hour." "You think he has destroyed them?" "I think it is possible, but I think it is also possible that he has not. Consider his character. This is a man who has spent 3 years producing meticulous forgeries, works of painstaking craftsmanship that required patience, skill, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Such a man does not destroy his own work easily. The forger's relationship with his forgeries is not unlike the artist's relationship with his art. He may know, intellectually, that the evidence must be eliminated, but the hands that created it may resist the act of destruction. You are gambling on his vanity. I am gambling on his nature. There is a difference." We arrived at Seckford Street at 10:30 the following morning, accompanied by Lestrade's Sergeant Bradstreet and the locksmith, a quiet, grey-haired man named Phipps, who carried a leather roll of tools not unlike Holmes's own. Lestrade himself was at Scotland Yard. I am conducting the interview with Klein that would keep him occupied for the better part of an hour. The workshop door presented 2 locks, a standard mortise and a secondary deadbolt of superior manufacture. Phipps examined both, selected his instruments, and had them open in under 4 minutes. Holmes nodded his approval, and we entered. The workshop was exactly as I remembered it from our interview 2 days earlier. Immaculate, ordered, every tool in its designated place on the pegboard, the disassembled piano still standing in the centre of the room like a patient on an operating table. The air smelled of linseed oil, wood shavings, and the faint chemical tang of solvents. Holmes stood in the doorway for a full minute before crossing the threshold, his eyes moving across every surface with that rapid, comprehensive sweep that took in details I would not notice in an hour of careful inspection. Then he entered and went directly to the pegboard where the tools hung in their precise rows. "The wrench," he said. It was where it had been during our previous visit, second pegboard, 3rd row, hanging from a brass hook between a set of voicing needles and a regulation screwdriver. Holmes lifted it down and held it in both hands, examining it with the care of a man handling a weapon recovered from a crime scene, which, in a sense, it was. The wrench was a heavy, well-made instrument, a T-shaped handle of polished steel with a hexagonal socket head at the business end. The socket was, as Klein had described, slightly oversized at 7/16 of an inch across the flats, ear with the rounded internal corners that Holmes had predicted from his examination of the bolt heads on the concealed mechanism. The handle showed years of use, the grip surfaces worn smooth, the steel darkened by the oils of Klein's hands. Holmes produced from his coat pocket a small tin box. Inside, nested in cotton wool, was the wax impression he had taken from the bolt heads of the pneumatic mechanism at Aeolian Hall. He set the impression on the workbench beside the wrench and examined both under his pocket lens, comparing the hexagonal pattern of the wax mould against the socket head of the wrench. He spent 10 minutes on the comparison, adjusting the angle of the lens, rotating the wax impression, measuring dimensions with his calipers. When he straightened, his expression held the controlled satisfaction of a man who has found precisely what he expected. "The match is exact," he said. "The socket dimensions correspond to within 1/1000th of an inch. The rounded internal corners of the socket head produce a distinctive contact pattern on the bolt faces, a slight radius at each corner of the hexagon, where a standard wrench would leave a sharp edge. The wax impression from the mechanism shows exactly this pattern, and here," he indicated a small irregularity on one face of the socket, "there is a manufacturing defect, a slight burr on the fourth face of the hexagon, where the toolmaker's broach left a ridge approximately 0.02 of an inch proud of the surrounding surface. This burr produces a corresponding scratch on the bolt head each time the wrench is engaged." He held the wax impression to the light. "The scratch is present on every one of the 6 bolt heads. The same defect, the same wrench, the same hand. No other tool in London could have produced these marks." He set the wrench down and turned his attention to the rest of the workshop. He moved through the space systematically, opening drawers, examining shelves, lifting the lids of storage boxes. Bradstreet watched from near the door, his notebook ready, recording each item Holmes identified. The open surfaces of the workshop yielded nothing unexpected: piano components, tuning equipment, reference books, supply catalogues. But Holmes was not interested in the open surfaces. He went to the workbench and began examining its construction, running his fingers along the edges of the thick oak top, pressing the joints, testing the weight of the front panel. "Hollow," he said, rapping a knuckle against the panel below the bench surface. The sound was distinctly different from the solid report of the oak top. He felt along the lower edge and found a recessed catch, a small brass lever, almost invisible against the dark wood, positioned where only a hand reaching deliberately beneath the bench would find it. He tripped the catch. A section of the bench front swung downward on concealed hinges, revealing a shallow compartment approximately 3 feet wide and 18 inches deep, built into the structure of the workbench itself. Inside, arranged with the same fastidious order that characterized everything in Klein's workshop, was a collection of materials that told the full story of the forgery operation. There were sheets of paper, not modern paper, but handmade sheets with the texture, weight and colour of 18th century ragstock. Holmes examined them and noted the watermarks, which reproduced the patterns of paper mills active in Vienna, London and Leipzig during the 1780s and 1790s. There were bottles of ink, not commercial ink, but hand-mixed formulations in shades of brown and black that replicated the iron gall inks used by composers of the classical period. There were steel-nib pens, carefully shaped to produce the characteristic stroke patterns of different historical hands. And there were reference materials, photographic reproductions of genuine manuscripts by Clementi, Dussek, Hummel, and others, annotated in Klein's handwriting, with technical observations about paper grain, ink density, staff line spacing, and notational idiosyncrasies. And at the back of the compartment, lying flat beneath the reference materials, was a partially completed manuscript. Holmes withdrew it carefully and laid it on the workbench. It was a piano sonata attributed to Jan Ladislav Dussek, written in a hand that mimicked the composer's known autograph with extraordinary fidelity. The paper was aged, the ink was faded, and the overall appearance was that of a document well over a century old. But the work was incomplete. The final 2 pages of the last movement were blank, the staves drawn but the notes not yet filled in. Klein had been interrupted mid-creation. The 8th forgery, Holmes said. Never completed, never sold. Klein was still producing when Varn discovered the scheme and confronted him. He examined the manuscript under his lens. The craftsmanship is exceptional. The paper is convincing, the ink formulation is historically accurate, and the musical content, he studied the notation, is composed with genuine understanding of Dussek's style. This is not mere copying. Klein was composing original music in the voice of a dead man. He is, in his way, an artist, a criminal artist, but an artist nonetheless. He replaced the manuscript and catalogued the remaining contents of the compartment, while Bradstreet recorded everything. When the inventory was complete, Holmes closed the false panel and restored the catch. "Leave everything as it is," he instructed Bradstreet. "I want Klein to know that we have found it. But I want him to see it undisturbed. The knowledge that his secret has been exposed, but that nothing has been taken, will produce a particular kind of psychological pressure that I intend to use." He took one final tour of the workshop, pausing at the pegboard to replace the wrench on its hook. As he did so, he noticed something I had overlooked, a small gap in the lowest row of tools, where a hook was present but empty. The outline on the pegboard's painted surface showed the shape of the missing item, a pair of heavy shears approximately 8 inches in length. "The cutting tool," Holmes said. "The shears he used to cut the damper cloth from the piano's interior and to cut the felt strips for the hammers. They are not here. He has disposed of them, probably in the Thames. It is the one precaution he has taken." He regarded the empty hook with something that might have been respect. He knew the shears would carry traces of the felt and the fish glue. He could not clean them thoroughly enough, so he eliminated them. But he could not bring himself to destroy the forgery materials or the wrench. The materials represent 3 years of work. The wrench represents 20 years of craft. He could not do it. We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes composed a detailed report for Lestrade summarizing the physical evidence, the matched tool marks, the forgery materials, the Schreiber letter, the timeline discrepancy established by Mrs. Cutler's testimony, and the identification of Klein by Hargrove as the intermediary in the manuscript sales. Fenny recommended that Klein be detained but not formally arrested until Holmes had the opportunity to confront him directly. "I want the final act to take place at Aeolian Hall," he told Lestrade when the inspector arrived at Baker Street that afternoon. "Assemble everyone. Klein, Moreau, Miss Weiss, Halberg, Mrs. Varn, the charwoman, Mrs. Cutler, the usher Coates, and Hargrove. I want them all in the same room, and I want that room to be the hall where the crime was committed." Lestrade was sceptical. "Is this necessary, Mr. Holmes? We have the evidence. We can arrest Klein tonight." "You can arrest him, yes. But a good arrest is not merely the apprehension of a suspect. It is the elimination of all doubt. There are 5 people connected to this case, each with secrets, each with apparent motives. But if you arrest Klein without publicly establishing the innocence of the others, the questions will linger. Moreau will remain under a cloud of suspicion. Mrs. Varn will be whispered about in drawing rooms. Miss Weiss will carry the stigma of association. I intend to close every door except one, and then walk through it." Lestrade agreed, though not without a muttered observation about theatrics and their proper place. Holmes ignored him. That evening, after Lestrade had departed to make the arrangements, I sat with Holmes in the firelit sitting room, while the sounds of Baker Street settled into the quieter rhythms of night. He had not spoken for some time, and I assumed he was reviewing the case in his mind, testing each link in the chain of evidence for weakness. "Watson," he said at last, "do you appreciate the particular cruelty of what was done to Elias Varn?" "He was murdered," I said. "That is cruelty enough." "He was murdered, yes, but consider what followed. His body was carried to the stage that was the centre of his professional life, the place where his art existed most fully. He was placed at his instrument, the instrument he had played for decades. That was as much a part of his identity as his own hands. And then that instrument was made to move, not by his skill, not by his art, but by a mechanism, a device built by the man who killed him. The audience watched and believed for 5 full minutes that they were witnessing Elias Varn perform. But what they were witnessing was Edmund Klein's performance, Klein's mechanism, Klein's engineering, Klein's design. He did not merely kill Varn. He replaced him. He erased the artist and substituted the machine. He stared into the fire. The cruelty was not merely in the killing, Watson. It was in the mockery. He made the dead man dance. I said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. Holmes reached for his violin, the old Stradivarius that had been his companion through more cases than I could count, and drew the bow across the strings. The sound that emerged was not a composition I recognized. It was improvised, searching, imperfect. A melody that wandered and hesitated and found its way by instinct rather than design. It was, I realized, the opposite of everything the player mechanism had produced. Uncertain, human, alive. He played for 20 minutes and then set the instrument aside and went to bed without another word. Chapter 9. The Gathering at Aeolian Hall. The assembly was arranged for 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after the murder. Lestrade had issued the invitations, framed at Holmes's insistence not as summonses, but as requests for a final review of witness statements, a routine procedural matter that would allow the police to close certain lines of inquiry. The language was deliberately bland, designed to alarm no one and to ensure that everyone attended. The hall was empty of its usual furniture. The auditorium seats had been covered with dust cloths in preparation for the next production, giving the space a ghostly shrouded quality that suited the occasion more than any stage designer could have planned. The stage itself was bare except for the Bechstein grand piano, airs which remained where it had stood on the night of the concert. Lestrade had arranged a semicircle of chairs on the stage, facing the piano, and it was here that the assembled company took their places. They arrived in 1s and 2s over the course of 20 minutes. Klein came first, punctual and composed, wearing a dark suit and an expression of sober cooperation. He took the chair nearest the piano with the ease of a man accustomed to proximity with the instrument, and folded his hands in his lap. Moreau arrived next, bristling with irritation, and took the seat farthest from Klein without acknowledging him. Clara Weiss came in on the arm of a friend, a fellow student who waited in the lobby, and sat with her eyes downcast, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Hallberg appeared shortly afterward, looking as though he had not slept in several days, his collar loose and his cravat improperly tied. Dorothea Varn arrived last among the principals, escorted by a solicitor whose presence she explained as a precaution. She was immaculate in black, her bearing upright, her expression unreadable. Lestrade had also arranged for the attendance of 3 additional figures: Alistair Hargrove, the Bloomsbury manuscripts dealer, who sat at the edge of the semicircle with the uncomfortable air of a man who did not understand why he had been included; Mrs. Cutler, the charwoman, who perched on her chair with the rigid dignity of a working woman determined not to be intimidated by her surroundings; and young Coates, the front-of-house usher, who kept glancing at the shrouded auditorium as though expecting the dead man to reappear. Holmes and I stood in the wings, observing the assembly through a gap in the curtain. Holmes was dressed with unusual care. His frock coat brushed, his collar starched, his cuffs precisely aligned. I'd seen him dressed this way before important confrontations. It was his armour, of a kind. "Are you ready?" I asked. "The evidence is ready, Watson. I am merely its presenter." He stepped onto the stage. The murmured conversation ceased. Every eye turned toward him, and in the silence that followed, the acoustics of the empty hall magnified his footsteps to something approaching ceremony. He did not sit. He stood beside the piano, one hand resting lightly on its closed lid, and addressed the assembly with the measured clarity of a man who has rehearsed nothing, because his command of the material requires no rehearsal. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attendance. I will be as brief as the complexity of this matter allows, and I will begin with what you all witnessed 4 evenings ago, the spectacle of a dead man performing at this piano. He paused and let the words settle. Every person in this hall that evening saw the same thing. Elias Varn seated at the Backstage, his fingers moving across the keys, producing no sound. For 5 minutes, 300 people watched and wondered. Some assumed artistic provocation. Some felt unease they could not articulate. None understood what they were seeing. What they were seeing was murder. Not in the act of commission, which had already occurred, but in its aftermath. They were watching a body that had been arranged, positioned, and animated by mechanical means to create the illusion of life where none remained. He opened the lid of the piano, propping it on its stand, and gestured toward the interior. The instrument was silenced. Strips of dense felt, piano damper cloth, hand-cut and affixed with fish glue, were wedged between every hammer and its corresponding string. The modification was recent and deliberate. It was done to conceal a second modification. He moved to the front of the piano, knelt, and removed the lower panel. Several members of the assembly leaned forward. Inside, visible now to everyone, was the compact pneumatic mechanism, the brass and steel and leather device that Holmes had examined days earlier. "A player mechanism," Holmes said, rising. "Hand-built, designed to fit inside this specific instrument, installed over a period of weeks during what were ostensibly routine maintenance visits. When activated, it drives the piano keys from below, reproducing a pre-encoded performance. In this case, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece Mr. Varn was scheduled to perform. The keys move. The audience sees a pianist playing, but the pianist is dead, and the music, had the instrument not been silenced, would have betrayed itself through its mechanical perfection. No rubato, no dynamic variation, no breath." He let the silence hold for a moment, then turned to the semicircle of faces. "I will now address each of you in turn. Some of you have secrets. All of you have been under suspicion. I intend to resolve both matters." He began with Moreau. "Mr. Moreau, you are a man of considerable talent and equally considerable bitterness. You were replaced as the headliner of this season by Elias Varn, and you made no secret of your resentment. Your remarks about the deceased have been hostile, public, and, I suspect, deliberately provocative. You wish to be noticed. You wish to be suspected even, because the attention of suspicion is still attention, and for a man in your position, any form of relevance is preferable to the alternative." Moreau's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. "The alternative," Holmes continued, more gently now, "is the truth you have been concealing. Your right hand suffers from an intermittent tremor, a condition that, if known, would end your performing career. You are not seeking to destroy Varn. You are seeking to survive his shadow long enough to secure a teaching position before your condition became public. Your hostility was the armor of a frightened man, not the aggression of a murderous one." Holmes paused. "You were in your seat in the third row from 7:30 onward, confirmed by more than a dozen witnesses. You could not have committed this crime, and the mechanical knowledge required to install the device you see before you is entirely outside your expertise. You are innocent, Mr. Moreau, and I say so publicly, so that no whisper of suspicion follows you from this room." Moreau looked at Holmes for a long moment. The hostility that had characterized every previous interaction between them was gone. In its place was something I had not expected to see on that proud, combative face. Gratitude. He inclined his head very slightly and said nothing. Holmes turned to Clara Weiss. "Miss Weiss, you were backstage on the evening of the concert between 7 o'clock and 20 minutes past. You visited Mr. Varn in the green room and found him distracted and uncommunicative. 3 days before the concert, you argued with him publicly outside a cafe in Kensington. Witnesses heard you say, 'You will regret how you have treated me.' The inference drawn by those witnesses, and by the press I have no doubt, was romantic. It was not." Clara raised her eyes. "Your argument with Mr. Varn concerned his decision to leave London for Vienna without providing you with a letter of recommendation or a referral to another teacher. After 3 years of study, he considered your talent insufficient to merit his professional endorsement. Your anger was the anger of a young artist betrayed by a mentor. You're not a lover scorned by an object of affection. You have allowed the romantic interpretation to persist because the truth that your teacher judged you and found you wanting is more painful than any fiction. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. There was a dignity in her bearing that had not been present during our earlier interview, the composure of a woman who has heard the worst said aloud and discovered that it is survivable. "You have no knowledge of piano mechanics," Holmes said. "You left the backstage area before the critical window. Your grief is genuine and your conscience is clear. You are innocent." He moved to Hallberg. "Mr. Hallberg, you have been embezzling from the concert series ticket revenues to service personal debts. The amounts are significant and the methods are clumsy. This is a matter for the financial courts, and I leave it to Inspector Lestrade to determine the appropriate course of action. But I will observe that your motive in this case ran precisely contrary to murder. A cancelled concert, or a dead headliner, was the worst possible outcome for your financial position. You needed Varn alive, performing, and generating revenue. You are guilty of fraud, Mr. Hallberg, but not of murder." Hallberg had gone very white. He opened his mouth, closed it, and stared at the floor. Holmes turned to Dorothea Varn. "Mrs. Varn, you arrived at the concert at approximately 12 minutes to 8, late, and without a satisfactory explanation. You claimed a broken carriage wheel. The claim is false. Your actual whereabouts between 7 o'clock and 7:48 that evening have been independently confirmed through inquiries I have conducted with the utmost discretion. You were engaged in a private matter that you cannot publicly disclose without personal consequence. I will say only that your alibi is solid, that your absence from the hall during the critical period is accounted for, and that your evasiveness, while understandable, is not evidence of guilt." He did not mention the solicitor Pembroke. He did not mention the affair. He afforded her exactly the measure of dignity that the situation allowed, and Dorothea Varn, whatever her feelings, acknowledged it with a single, controlled nod. 4 suspects eliminated, 4 secrets exposed, each one painful, and each one insufficient to explain the machinery of murder that sat exposed in the belly of the grand piano. Holmes turned to the 5th chair, to Edmund Klein. The room had grown very still. Moreau sat motionless, his hands in his lap. Clara had stopped crying. Hallberg stared at the floor. Dorothea Varn watched Holmes with an expression I could not read. Hargrove, at the edge of the semicircle, had gone rigid in his seat. Mrs. Cutler and Coates sat like figures in a tableau, sensing that the gravity of the proceedings had shifted and concentrated itself upon the quiet, solidly built man who sat nearest to the piano. Klein met Holmes's gaze. His expression had not changed throughout the preceding revelations. He had watched each elimination with the composed attentiveness of a spectator at a chess match, interested, analytical, uninvolved. If anything, there was a faint trace of professional appreciation in his manner, as though he recognized the quality of the performance being conducted before him and could not entirely suppress his admiration for its construction. Holmes regarded him in silence for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Mr. Klein, let us discuss the piano." Chapter 10. The Silent Pianist's Final Note. Holmes did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The acoustics of the empty hall carried every syllable to every ear, and the silence of the assembled company was so complete that I could hear the faint ticking of Lestrade's pocket watch from where I stood in the wings. "This instrument," Holmes said, resting his hand on the piano's case, "has been in your care for 6 years. You tuned it, regulated it, voiced it. You knew its dimensions to the fraction of an inch. You knew the clearances inside its case, the tolerances of its action, the precise configuration of its internal bracing. You knew it, Mr. Klein, the way a surgeon knows the body of a patient he has operated on repeatedly, not as an abstraction, but as a physical reality mapped in the memory of your hands." Klein said nothing. His posture had not changed, but I noticed that his fingers, which had been loosely interlaced in his lap, were now still, held in place with a deliberateness that suggested conscious control. The mechanism concealed inside this piano was not a commercial device, Holmes continued. It was designed and built by hand to fit this specific instrument. The pneumatic system, the connecting rods, the paper roll encoding, all of it bespoke. All of it crafted with the precision of a man who works in thousandths of an inch. The installation required multiple visits over a period of weeks. The lower panel was removed and replaced at least 4 times. The wear pattern on the varnish is progressive, showing successive degradation consistent with repeated access. He knelt beside the open lower panel and indicated the brass fittings that secured the mechanism to the piano's frame. These bolts are non-standard, 7/16 of an inch across the flats, an unusual size driven by an unusual tool. The tool marks on every bolt head are identical, and they share a distinctive characteristic, a slight scoring on the 4th face of the hexagon, produced by a manufacturing defect in the wrench, a burr on the broaching surface, approximately 2/1000 of an inch proud. He reached into his coat and produced the small tin box containing the wax impression. He opened it and held it toward Klein. I took this impression from the bolt heads 3 days ago. Yesterday I compared it against the custom tuning wrench that hangs on the second pegboard of your workshop. The wrench you designed yourself, had manufactured to your specifications by a toolmaker in Sheffield, and which you told me with evident pride has no duplicate in London. The match is exact, Mr. Klein. The dimensions, the radius of the internal corners, and the defect on the 4th face. Your tool installed this mechanism. No other tool could have. Klein looked at the wax impression. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A fractional recalculation, marked the momentary adjustment of a man who has been expecting a particular blow and now feels it land. Holmes straightened and moved to the timeline. You signed out of the Backstage logbook at 7:20 on the evening of the concert. You told me, and you told Inspector Lestrade, that you left the building, went home to change, and returned through the front entrance at approximately 7:42. The usher, Mr. Coates, confirms your arrival at the front doors at that time. He also noted that you were slightly breathless and paused in the lobby to adjust your cuffs. He turned to the charwoman. Mrs. Cutler, would you please repeat for the company what you told me regarding the evening of the concert? Mrs. Cutler sat up straighter. I was mopping the corridor on the 2nd floor, sir. The half-hour bell had just sounded. That's 7:30. I heard footsteps in the Backstage corridor below me. A man's tread, sir. Steady and deliberate. Thank you, Mrs. Cutler. Holmes turned back to Klein. 15 minutes after you signed out of the building, footsteps were heard in the Backstage corridor. 7 minutes after those footsteps, you appeared at the front entrance, breathless. The explanation is not complex. You did not leave at 7:20. You signed out, concealed yourself in the instrument storage room adjacent to the green room, and waited. At 7:33, you emerged. At 7:35, you entered the green room, where Elias Varn sat alone. Holmes walked to the piano and placed his hand on the closed keyboard cover. You strangled him with a strip of damper cloth cut from the interior of this instrument, a strip approximately 24 inches long and 2 inches wide, removed with heavy shears from the damper lining. The cloth is wide, soft, and distributes pressure evenly across the throat. It compresses the airway and the carotid arteries without leaving the conspicuous marks of a rope or a wire. It was designed, chosen, to produce a death that might, on cursory examination, be mistaken for cardiac failure. He produced from his waistcoat pocket one of the glass slides on which the recovered fibres were mounted. I extracted these fibres from the skin folds of Mr. Varn's neck and from the weave of his collar. Under microscopic examination, they are identical in colour, dye composition, and weave density to the damper cloth used inside this piano. A section of that cloth has been cut away. The gap is visible in the internal lining. The dimensions of the missing section correspond to a ligature of sufficient length and width to encircle a man's throat. He replaced the slide and faced Klein directly. You killed him in the green room. You dragged the body to the stage, feet first, through the door and along the corridor, a distance of 40 feet. You positioned him at the instrument, arranged his hands on the keys, activated the mechanism, and exited through the service corridor to the alley. You circled the building and entered through the front doors at 7:42, slightly breathless from the exertion and the haste. The entire operation, from the moment of the killing to your appearance in the lobby, took approximately 7 minutes. You had rehearsed it. You knew the route, the timing, and the distances. Nothing was left to chance. Holmes paused. The hall was utterly silent. But the question remains, why? Why kill a man you had served for 14 years? Why kill him on this particular night, in this particular manner? He turned to Hargrove, who had been sitting at the edge of the semicircle with the expression of a man who has only now begun to understand why he was invited. "Mr. Hargrove, do you recognize anyone in this assembly?" Hargrove's eyes moved across the faces before him. They stopped on Klein. The colour left his cheeks. "That is the man," he said. "The man who called himself Mercer. The man who brought me the manuscripts." Holmes nodded. "Over the past 3 years, mister. And Klein has been forging replicas of rare 18th century musical manuscripts, works by Clementi, Dussek, and lesser-known contemporaries of Mozart, and selling them through Mr. Hargrove's dealership under a false name. He used his access to Mr. Varn's private collection to study the originals. He produced forgeries of remarkable quality using period-appropriate paper, hand-mixed inks, and a deep understanding of historical notational styles. 7 manuscripts were sold for a combined total exceeding £4,000, authenticated by the implicit provenance of Elias Varn's name and reputation. He produced the Schreiber letter from his pocket. 10 days before the concert, a Viennese collector named Herr Friedrich Schreiber wrote to Varn thanking him for a Clementi manuscript that Varn had never sold. Varn confronted Klein. He wrote 2 words in the margin of the letter. K. How long? He intended to make a public statement after the Aeolian Hall performance, exposing the forgeries and severing his association with Klein permanently. Holmes held Klein's gaze. "You faced criminal prosecution, professional destruction, and financial ruin. Everything you had built over 20 years, your reputation, your livelihood, your standing in a community that trusted you, would be annihilated by a single public statement from the man you had defrauded. The concert was your deadline. After that night, Varn would speak, so you ensured that he would not." He stepped back. The case was laid out. Mechanism, tool, timeline, fibres, motive, identification, each element placed with the precision of a craftsman assembling a complex instrument. The chain was complete. Klein sat in silence for a long time. The assembled company watched him. Moreau, Clara, Hulberg, Dorothea. Each face held a different expression, but all shared the same fixed attention, the same held breath. When Klein spoke, his voice was level. There was no tremor in it, no break, no plea. He spoke with the measured precision of a man who has been constructing his own account of events and has decided, at last, to deliver it. Elias Varn was a vain man, he said. He hoarded beautiful music the way a miser hoards gold, locked it behind glass, showed it to visitors as a display of wealth, and never once considered that the works in his collection belonged to the world, not to his drawing room. The Clementi sonatas, the Dussek fragments, these were compositions of genuine historical significance, and they sat in a cabinet in Kensington, seen by no one, studied by no one, contributing nothing. He unfolded his hands. "I did not steal them. I copied them. The originals remained in his collection. What I sold were reproductions. Faithful, yes. Deceptive, yes. But the music they contained was real. Collectors in Vienna, Paris, and Edinburgh now possess manuscripts they treasure, study, and share. The music is alive in the world because of what I did. Varn would have kept it entombed. Holmes listened without interruption. When Klein had finished, the silence that followed was not the silence of agreement, but of something more complicated, the quiet that descends when a plausible argument has been advanced in defence of an indefensible act. "You speak of liberating music," Holmes said, "and yet the man who composed nothing, who created no art of his own, chose to end the life of a man who did. You speak of beauty, and yet you strangled your friend with a strip of velvet and made a puppet of his body for 300 people to watch. You speak of the world's right to hear these works, and yet you silence the one man whose performance gave them voice." He took a step closer. "You did not silence the pianist, Mr. Klein. You replaced him with a performance of your own. But every mechanism, however cleverly constructed, eventually reveals the hand that built it." Klein held his gaze for a moment longer. Then he looked away, not downward, not in shame, but toward the piano, the instrument that had been the centre of his professional life and the instrument of his crime. His expression in that final moment was one I did not expect, not defiance, not remorse, but a profound and private weariness, as though the effort of maintaining his composure had finally exhausted a reserve he had believed to be inexhaustible. Lestrade stepped forward. The arrest was made quietly, without resistance. Klein stood, buttoned his coat, and walked from the stage between two constables with the same measured tread that Mrs. Cutler had heard in the backstage corridor 4 nights earlier. He did not look back. The assembly dispersed in silence. Moreau left first, walking quickly, his right hand thrust deep in his coat pocket. Clara Weiss was led away by her friend, her face pale but composed. Hallberg lingered, speaking in low, urgent tones with Lestrade, the beginning, I suspected, of a longer and more painful reckoning. And Dorothea Varn departed on the arm of her solicitor without speaking to anyone. Hargrove left last, looking shaken and very much aware that his own role in the affair would require further examination. Holmes and I walked back to Baker Street through the late afternoon. The October light was thin and golden, slanting between the buildings of Mayfair, and the streets were filled with the ordinary traffic of a city that knew nothing of what had just occurred in the empty hall on New Bond Street. Holmes did not speak until we had reached the sitting-room, and he had settled into his armchair with his pipe. "Watson," he said, "do you think there was any justice in Klein's argument? That the manuscripts belong to the world?" I considered the question. "There may be a grain of truth in the principle," I said. But the principle does not survive the act. A man who strangles his friend and makes a marionette of his corpse has forfeited the right to speak of beauty." Holmes looked at me with an expression I could not entirely decipher. Surprise, perhaps, or a kind of quiet recognition. "You have put it better than I could," he said. He reached for his violin. The Stradivarius came to his shoulder, the bow found the strings, and he began to play. Not the Chopin nocturne, not anything I recognized, but something improvised and searching, full of hesitations and recoveries, wrong notes corrected and phrases abandoned and begun again. It was not a polished performance. It was not metronomically precise. It was, in every particular, the opposite of the mechanical perfection that had animated a dead man's fingers 4 nights earlier. It was imperfect. It was expressive. It was alive. I sat in my chair and listened, and the fire burned low and the sounds of Baker Street settled around us, and for a little while the room was filled with nothing but the living, breathing, beautifully imperfect sound of a human hand upon the strings.